I funded my husband's dream startup for 10 years only to discover he put his secretary on our family health insurance instead of me. Sarah spent her days in the high-pressure environment of the operating room, performing complex surgeries that required nerves of steel, only to come home to a husband who treated her like an ATM with a pulse. For a full decade, she had been the primary breadwinner, the one who worked double shifts and skipped sleep so that Mark could chase his dream of building a world-changing tech startup. She didn't mind the sacrifice at first because she truly believed they were a team, and she felt a sense of pride every time Mark talked about his vision for the future. She poured every extra cent into his business, paying for his office space, his high-end computers, and even the health insurance for his small team of developers. But as the company finally started to see some real success, Mark didn't become more grateful. Instead, he became a stranger. The man who used to share his every thought now kept his phone locked with a password he refused to give her, and he started staying out until the early hours of the morning, claiming he was at networking events or investor dinners. Sarah wanted to believe him, but the house felt increasingly empty, and the silence between them was heavy with things he wasn't saying. Their 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, was the first one to really feel the shift, often sitting by the window waiting for a father who never showed up for bedtime stories or weekend trips to the park. When Mark did come home, he was irritable and cold, picking fights about the house being messy or Sarah looking tired, as if her hard work was an inconvenience to him. He started wearing designer clothes that Sarah hadn't bought him and splashing out on luxury items that made no sense for a company that was supposed to be reinvesting all its profits. Sarah tried to talk to him about their budget, but Mark would just snap at her, calling her controlling and saying she didn't understand the pressures of being a CEO. The emotional distance grew so wide that they were like two ships passing in the night, with Sarah doing all the heavy lifting for the family while Mark lived like a bachelor. The first real crack in the facade happened on a mundane Tuesday morning when Sarah tried to schedule a checkup for a persistent cough she'd been having. When the insurance coordinator called her back, they told her there was a problem with her coverage. The woman on the phone sounded confused, explaining that the primary policyholder, Mark, had recently updated the family plan, but Sarah's name wasn't on the list of dependents anymore. Sarah felt a cold wave of nausea hit her as she sat in her hospital scrubs, surrounded by the equipment she worked so hard to afford. She assumed it was just a paperwork error, a glitch in the new HR system Mark had set up, but the seed of doubt had been planted. She began to look at the life she had built for them with new eyes, noticing how Mark always turned his body away when he took a call and how he had suddenly stopped mentioning his executive assistant, Vanessa, even though she seemed to be in every photo on the company's website. Sarah realized that the man she had supported for 10 years wasn't just drifting away. He was actively pushing her out. She had spent a decade building a pedestal for him, working herself to the bone so he could have everything he ever wanted. And now that he was finally at the top, he was looking for a way to get rid of the woman who put him there. The house that was supposed to be their sanctuary felt like a crime scene, and Sarah was just beginning to realize that the person she loved was the one who was stealing her future. She stood in her kitchen that night, watching Mark walk past her without a word, his eyes glued to his phone, and she realized that the administrative error with the insurance was just the tip of a very dark iceberg. Every sentence she had ever heard him say about loyalty and partnership now felt like a lie, a carefully constructed script designed to keep her working while he planned his getaway. The realization was a slow, painful burn in her chest, a feeling that everything she had worked for was being handed over to someone else while she was left with the bills and the heartbreak. The suspicion grew from a small seed into a thick, suffocating vine that wrapped around every corner of Sarah's life, making her feel like a ghost in the very home she paid for. After the insurance shock, she began to notice that the long nights at the office Mark always complained about were strangely quiet whenever she called his desk phone, and his cell phone was always shielded like a state secret. One Saturday morning, while Mark was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand with a notification that didn't look like a business email. It was a heart emoji from a contact saved only as the architect. Sarah's heart raced as she realized that while she was performing life-saving surgeries, Mark was busy building a fantasy world with someone else. She tried to confront him over breakfast, keeping her voice calm for Chloe's sake. But Mark's reaction was terrifyingly smooth. He laughed in her face, telling her she was delusional and that the stress of the hospital was finally breaking her mind, a tactic that left her questioning her own reality. But the evidence was starting to scream. Chloe came home from school one day and mentioned she'd seen Daddy at the mall holding hands with a pretty lady with yellow hair, a description that matched Vanessa, Mark's assistant, perfectly. The betrayal felt like a physical weight in Sarah's lungs, especially when she realized that the business expenses Mark was charging to their joint credit card were actually for jewelry and weekend trips she never went on. She started digging into the company's digital files late at night and found something that made her blood turn to ice. Mark had been using their personal mortgage fund to pay for a secret apartment in the city. The most heartbreaking moment came when Sarah found a hidden folder on their shared cloud drive labeled Future Plans, filled with photos of Mark and Vanessa looking like a happy couple, scouting vacation homes in Italy. The man Sarah had funded for 10 years was literally shopping for a new life, using her hard-earned money while she was still at home doing his laundry and raising his child. Every time she looked at him, she saw a predator who had spent a decade grooming her to be his financial safety net while he waited for a better option to come along. The social cracks were showing too. Their mutual friends started acting strange around her, dropping hints that Mark was seen out at bars with a younger woman. Yet they were too afraid of his new tech mogul status to tell her the truth. Sarah felt completely isolated, trapped in a house that was built on a foundation of lies. Watching her husband play the role of the devoted family man for the cameras while he was already halfway out the door, the tension became so thick that even the air in the living room felt toxic, and Chloe began to cling to Sarah's leg, sensing that the man in the house wasn't the father she used to know. The ultimate hook happened when Sarah received a notification from their bank about a massive withdrawal. $50,000 moved into an offshore account she didn't know existed. When she called Mark to ask about it, he didn't even make an excuse. He just told her that the company needed a bridge loan and hung up on her. In that moment, Sarah realized she wasn't just a wife or a partner. She was a victim of a long-term financial and emotional scam. Mark wasn't just cheating on her with a woman. He was cheating on her with her own life, stealing her time, her money, and her dignity to gift it to someone who hadn't worked a single day to earn it. She stood in her daughter's bedroom that night, looking at the drawings of a happy family on a wall, and realized that the man in those pictures was a ghost, and the man downstairs was a thief who was currently planning the final heist of her heart. The discovery that finally broke the silence wasn't a whisper or a rumor, but a cold, hard document that Sarah found tucked inside a nondescript legal envelope hidden in Mark's gym bag. As she pulled out the papers, her hands shook with a violent tremor she usually only felt during the most intense surgical emergencies. It was a formal enrollment form for the company's new premium health and dental executive plan, and there, listed in the space for spouse, domestic partner, was Vanessa's name and social security number. Sarah felt the floor drop away as she realized that Mark hadn't just made an error at the insurance office. He had systematically replaced her with his mistress in the eyes of the law and the corporation she had helped him build. The betrayal was so deep and so calculated that Sarah felt a strange, cold clarity take over her mind, replacing the confusion of the past few months. She didn't scream or cry. She waited in the dark kitchen for Mark to return from his late-night strategy session. The insurance papers spread out on the island like a roadmap of his deception. When the door finally clicked open and Mark walked in, smelling of expensive bourbon and that same vanilla perfume, he didn't even notice the atmosphere until he saw the documents. For a second, his face went pale, but then the mask of the tech mogul returned, and he had the audacity to tell her that it was a tax strategy and that she was being dramatic about a simple paperwork shortcut. The confrontation quickly spiraled into a high-stakes emotional battle as Sarah revealed she knew about the secret apartment, the offshore account, and the future plans folder. The stakes reached a breaking point when Chloe, woken up by the shouting, stood at the top of the stairs clutching her stuffed bear and asked why Daddy was saying he didn't want to live in their house anymore. Mark didn't even go to comfort her. He just looked at Sarah with a cold, predatory gaze and told her that she could never prove he stole the money because she had signed the papers giving him power of attorney years ago. He stood there, in the home her surgeon's salary had bought, and told her that he was the visionary and she was just the bankroll that had finally run dry. The emotional peak of the night came when Mark's phone buzzed on the counter with a text from Vanessa asking if he had dealt with the problem yet. Referring to his own wife and daughter as a business obstacle, Sarah realized in that moment that she wasn't just fighting for her marriage, she was fighting for her life and her daughter's future against a man who had spent 10 years pretending to love her while secretly planning her erasure. The high-tension hook dropped when Mark flatly told her that if she tried to divorce him or expose the affair, he would use his new corporate legal team to paint her as an unstable, drug-addicted surgeon who was too busy at the hospital to care for her child. He wasn't just leaving. He was threatening to take Chloe and use Sarah's own career against her to ensure she walked away with nothing. The house, which Sarah had spent a decade turning into a home, suddenly felt like a cage where the bars were made of her own money and his cold-blooded lies. As Mark walked out to spend the night at his secret apartment, leaving Sarah alone with a sobbing child and a mountain of evidence, she realized that the discovery phase was over and the war had truly begun. She sat on the floor of the kitchen, surrounded by the proof of a decade of betrayal, and knew that the man she had funded was no longer her husband, but a dangerous enemy who was ready to destroy everything she loved to protect his new, stolen life. The aftermath of the discovery felt like being pushed into a cold, dark ocean where every wave was a new legal threat or a social betrayal designed to sink Sarah's reputation. Mark didn't waste a single second, moving with a clinical cruelty that proved he had been planning this exit for years while Sarah was busy saving lives in the operating room. Within days, the neighborhood gossip mill was churning with a story Mark had carefully planted, suggesting that Sarah's long hours at the hospital had led to a secret pill addiction and that he was the suffering husband just trying to keep their family together. Sarah found herself walking into the hospital and feeling the heavy weight of judgmental stares from colleagues who had once respected her. Realized that Mark was using his new tech mogul influence to poison her professional world. The legal pressure was even worse. Mark's high-priced lawyers, paid for with the very money Sarah had given him to start his company, served her with papers demanding full custody of Chloe and a massive monthly support payment, claiming she was an unfit mother due to her demanding schedule. The manipulation reached a terrifying peak when Sarah tried to access their joint savings, only to find that Mark had completely drained the accounts, leaving her with a mountain of debt from the business loans she had co-signed in good faith. She was stuck in a house she couldn't afford to keep, fighting a man who was using her own hard-earned wealth to hire private investigators to follow her every move. The social pressure became suffocating when Mark's mistress, Vanessa, began posting photos on social media of herself and Sarah's vacation home, wearing jewelry that Sarah had noticed missing months ago, effectively flaunting the theft of Sarah's life in front of the entire community. Chloe was caught in the middle of this nightmare, crying because her father told her that mommy cared more about her patients than her own daughter. A lie so sharp it felt like a surgical blade to Sarah's heart. Even Sarah's own sister began to question her, wondering if Mark was right about the emotional neglect, showing just how deep his gaslighting had reached into their inner circle. The real hook dropped during a mandatory mediation session when Mark sat across from her with a smirk, sliding a document across the table that showed he had secretly patented his new software under a shell company owned entirely by Vanessa, meaning the multi-million-dollar empire Sarah had funded was legally out of her reach. He leaned in and whispered that she should just sign the papers and walk away with her dignity, or he would make sure the hospital board heard about her mental instability and stripped her of her medical license. Sarah realized then that Mark wasn't just trying to win a divorce. He was trying to delete her from existence so he could start over with a clean slate and a full bank account. The pressure to give up was enormous, as the legal fees piled up and the smear campaign intensified, leaving Sarah feeling like she was fighting a war on 10 different fronts with no allies in sight. But as she looked at the smug man across the table, she remembered the years of discipline and focus it took to become a surgeon, and she realized that Mark had made one fatal mistake. He thought she was weak because she was kind, but he was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to take a mother's child and a doctor's life's work. The finale of the war between Sarah and Mark didn't happen in a corporate boardroom or a luxury office, but in a sterile, wood-paneled courtroom where Mark's massive ego finally tripped over the digital trail he thought he had deleted forever. "Sarah, using the same cold, surgical focus she utilized during 10-hour heart surgeries. Had stopped crying weeks ago and started calculating. She had hired a top-tier team of digital forensic experts and private investigators who specialized in untraceable wealth. While Mark was busy acting like a high-flying tech genius in front of his socialite friends and bragging about his impending freedom to Vanessa, Sarah was quietly uncovering the ghost transactions he had used to bleed her dry for a decade. The courtroom was packed on the final day of the hearing. Mark sat at the petitioner's table, looking every bit the successful CEO in a $3,000 suit Sarah had indirectly paid for. His lawyers tried one last, desperate attempt to paint Sarah as an unstable, absent mother whose obsession with her career had forced Mark to look for emotional support elsewhere. They showed logs of her late nights at the hospital as evidence of child neglect, trying to weaponize her life-saving work against her to steal custody of Chloe. But the mood in the room shifted instantly, turning from curious to horrified when Sarah's legal team presented a series of internal company emails that were never meant to see the light of day. These weren't just business notes. They were a step-by-step manual of betrayal. Sarah's experts had recovered a deleted thread between Mark and Vanessa titled The Exit Strategy. In these emails, Mark detailed exactly how he planned to drain the bankroll, his disgusting nickname for Sarah before filing for divorce. He wrote about how he had intentionally manipulated her into co-signing business loans that were actually being diverted into his offshore accounts. The most shocking piece of evidence, however, was a recorded conversation from a smart home device in their secret city apartment. In the recording, Mark's voice was clear and mocking as he laughed with Vanessa about how easy it was to trick Sarah into paying for their engagement ring by telling her the company needed an emergency equipment upgrade. The judge's face turned to stone as the recording played through the courtroom speakers. The silence that followed was absolute. The ruling that followed was a total, systematic destruction of Mark's empire, because Mark had used Sarah's personal income to fund the startup while simultaneously committing fraud. The judge ruled that the company was a marital asset created through deception. Sarah was granted 70% of the company's total shares and all of its intellectual property. Even more satisfying, the judge saw through the smear campaign against Sarah's parenting, granting her sole physical custody of Chloe and ordering Mark to pay back every single cent he had siphoned from their joint accounts over the last 5 years. The social fallout was instant and brutal. Mark's investors, who were mostly high-profile figures terrified of being linked to a public fraudster and a wife scammer, pulled their funding and canceled their contracts overnight. The visionary CEO became a pariah in the tech world before he even left the courthouse. Vanessa, seeing that the money was gone and the mogul was now a man buried in millions of dollars of legal debt, didn't even wait for the final decree. She disappeared within a week, taking the luxury car and whatever jewelry she could pack, leaving Mark to face the consequences alone. Mark was left with nothing but the massive bills for the high-priced lawyers he could no longer afford to pay for Sarah. The victory wasn't about the money, the shares, or the revenge. It was about the moment she walked Chloe into their new, quiet home, free from the suffocating shadow of Mark's lies. She didn't stay in the tech world. She used her majority stake to sell the company to a competitor for a staggering fortune. She then used a huge portion of those millions to establish a foundation that provides legal and financial aid to women who are victims of white-collar domestic abuse and financial coercion. She returned to the hospital not as the haggard or neglectful wife Mark tried to create, but as the most respected and powerful surgeon on the staff. Her reputation restored and her spirit forged in fire. As she sat on her porch watching Chloe play in the garden one evening, Sarah realized that the 10 years she wasted on Mark weren't a waste at all. They were the years she proved she could build an empire from scratch and survive the person who tried to steal it. She had funded a man's dream, and when he turned out to be a monster, she had the surgical precision to cut him out of her life forever. The story ended not with the tragedy of a broken heart, but with the triumph of a woman who finally knew her own worth and would never let anyone else hold the pen to her story again.